On a rain-soaked October morning in 1962, contractors renovating the Henderson family estate in Millbrook, Pennsylvania made a discovery that would haunt the small industrial town for generations. What began as a routine basement expansion to convert the century-old Victorian mansion into apartments quickly transformed into the most horrific crime scene in the state's history. Behind a false wall in the mansion's sub-basement, workers uncovered a charnel house containing the remains of 39 souls, their bodies arranged in patterns that defied explanation and preserved in conditions that challenged everything. Investigators thought they knew about death and decomposition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Henderson name had been synonymous with prosperity and respectability in Millbrook for over 8 decades. 3 generations of the family had built their fortune on steel manufacturing, banking, and real estate development that transformed the sleepy farming community into a thriving industrial center. But the discovery in that basement would expose secrets so disturbing that federal agents sealed the case files for 50 years. And the town's surviving residents still speak of the Henderson horror only in whispers behind locked doors. The investigation that followed was deliberately limited and suspiciously brief. Key witnesses died under mysterious circumstances, evidence disappeared from police custody, and the few officials brave enough to pursue the truth found themselves transferred to distant jurisdictions or forced into early retirement. What the authorities discovered in that basement threatened to unravel not just the Henderson legacy, but the carefully constructed facade of respectability that had hidden decades of systematic murder, corruption, and unspeakable rituals that reached into the highest levels of Pennsylvania's political and business establishment. The truth about what happened in the Henderson basement would reveal a conspiracy of silence that stretched from Millbrook's main street to the governor's mansion in Harrisburg, involving judges, police chiefs, business leaders, and politicians, whose names still grace public buildings and street signs throughout central Pennsylvania today. The 39 victims found in that underground tomb were not random casualties of a serial killer's madness, but carefully selected participants in rituals so horrific that even hardened homicide detectives requested transfers rather than continue investigating the case. Millbrook in 1962 stood as a testament to American industrial prosperity. The town of 15,000 souls nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania had grown from a collection of farms and mills into a bustling manufacturing center, its economy powered by the Henderson Steel Works that employed nearly half the local workforce. Neat rows of company houses lined the streets radiating out from the massive factory complex, while the town's business district buzzed with the activity of banks, shops, and restaurants that catered to the steady wages of steel workers and their families. The Henderson mansion dominated the town's most prestigious neighborhood from its perch on Elm Hill, a 3-story Victorian palace built in 1881 by the family patriarch, industrialist Thomas Henderson. The house commanded a view of the entire Millbrook Valley, its elaborate gingerbread trim and wraparound porches serving as a constant reminder of the family's wealth and influence. For 8 decades, the mansion had hosted the town's most important social gatherings, political meetings, and business negotiations, its grand ballroom and formal dining rooms serving as the unofficial seat of power for all of central Pennsylvania. The Henderson family had arrived in Millbrook in 1879, when Thomas Henderson purchased the failing Millbrook Iron Works for a fraction of its value during the economic depression that followed the Panic of 1873. Within 5 years, he had transformed the struggling foundry into one of Pennsylvania's most profitable steel production facilities, securing lucrative government contracts for railroad, construction, and military weapons that made the Henderson name synonymous with quality and reliability throughout the industrial Northeast. Thomas Henderson possessed the ruthless business acumen and political connections necessary to build an industrial empire in the cutthroat world of 19th century manufacturing. Standing over 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes and a commanding presence that dominated any room he entered, he cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and business leaders from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. His reputation for getting results, regardless of the methods required, made him a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy. The mansion itself reflected Thomas Henderson's ambitions and his taste for the dramatic. The house contained 22 rooms, spread across 3 floors with hand-carved mahogany paneling, imported Italian marble fireplaces, and crystal chandeliers that had been shipped from European craftsmen. But it was the basement levels that would later prove most significant to the horror that unfolded there. Unlike most Victorian homes, which typically featured simple root cellars or storage areas, the Henderson mansion boasted an elaborate underground complex that extended far beyond the house's foundation. Thomas Henderson had insisted on the extensive basement construction, claiming he needed secure storage for important business documents and valuable items. The sub-basement level, accessible only through a hidden door behind the main furnace, contained a series of interconnected chambers that had been carved from the native limestone and reinforced with brick and steel. The official blueprints filed with the county showed these areas as wine cellars and storage rooms, but the actual construction included features that served far different purposes. By 1962, control of the Henderson Empire had passed to Thomas's grandson, Richard Henderson, a man who had inherited his grandfather's business instincts but possessed an appetite for power that extended beyond mere financial success. Richard had expanded the family's interests into banking, real estate development, and political influence, serving on the boards of 3 banks, 2 hospitals, and the State University. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His connections reached into every aspect of Millbrook's civic and business life, from the mayor's office to the police department to the county courthouse. Richard Henderson stood as one of central Pennsylvania's most respected citizens, a pillar of the community who donated generously to local charities, served on church boards, and hosted elaborate social gatherings that brought together the region's most influential families. His marriage to Margaret Wilson, daughter of a prominent Philadelphia banking family, had further cemented his social standing and provided connections to old money establishment that valued bloodlines as much as bank accounts. But beneath Richard Henderson's carefully cultivated public image lay appetites and ambitions that would have horrified the community that held him in such high regard. Beginning in the early 1950s, he had begun using his family's basement complex for activities that bore no resemblance to wine storage or document preservation. The limestone chambers had been modified to serve purposes that required privacy, soundproofing, and the kind of security that could ensure absolute secrecy. The transformation of the Henderson basement into something far more sinister had begun gradually, with Richard claiming he needed this space for important business meetings that required discretion. He installed expensive soundproofing, upgraded the electrical systems, and added ventilation equipment that he claimed was necessary for proper climate control to preserve sensitive documents. But the contractors who performed this work noticed features that seemed unusual for simple storage areas, including drainage systems, reinforced walls, and lighting arrangements that suggested the spaces would be used for activities requiring careful observation and documentation. Margaret Henderson remained blissfully unaware of her husband's true interests, accepting his explanations about business meetings and private consultations with clients who required absolute confidentiality. She had grown accustomed to Richard's long hours and frequent overnight absences, attributing them to the demands of managing the family's extensive business interests. Her own social activities kept her occupied with charity work, garden club, meetings, and the elaborate entertaining that was expected of a woman in her position. The couple's two children, Thomas IV and Elizabeth, had been sent to exclusive boarding schools in New England, returning to Millbrook only for holidays and summer vacations. This arrangement suited Richard perfectly, as it meant fewer questions about his activities and less risk of accidental discoveries. The children knew their father as a successful businessman who worked hard to maintain the family's prominence, never suspecting that his late-night meetings in the basement involved activities that would have destroyed everything they believed about their family's respectability. The first signs that something was seriously amiss with Richard Henderson emerged in the summer of 1961, when Millbrook began experiencing an unusual number of disappearances among its transient population. Drifters, seasonal workers, and others on the margins of society began vanishing with alarming frequency, but their absence went largely unnoticed by the town's respectable citizens, who had little interest in the fate of people they considered undesirable elements. Dr. James Morrison, who served as Millbrook's coroner and maintained the county's records of missing persons, began noticing patterns that disturbed his professional sensibilities. The missing individuals were invariably young adults between the ages of 20 and 35, both male and female, who lacked family connections or steady employment that would trigger extensive searches when they disappeared. Most had arrived in Millbrook seeking work at the steel plant or passing through on their way to larger cities, making them ideal candidates for predators who sought victims that would not be missed. Even more troubling was the fact that several of the missing persons had last been seen in the company of well-dressed individuals who claimed to be offering employment opportunities or assistance. Witnesses described these benefactors as professional-looking men who spoke with authority and seemed to possess the kind of connections that could provide real opportunities for advancement. The descriptions could have applied to any number of Millbrook's business leaders, making identification impossible without more specific details. Detective Robert Hayes of the Millbrook Police Department had grown increasingly frustrated with the department's handling of the missing persons cases. Hayes was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had worked his way up from patrol officer to detective through diligent police work and an uncompromising commitment to justice. But his attempts to investigate the disappearances had been met with resistance from his superiors, who seemed more interested in maintaining Millbrook's reputation as a safe, prosperous community than in discovering what had happened to society's most vulnerable members. Police Chief William Crawford, who owed his position to political connections that included strong support from the Henderson family, had made it clear that extensive investigations into missing transients would not be welcomed by the town's business community. Crawford argued that scarce police resources should be focused on protecting Millbrook's respectable citizens, rather than chasing shadows in search of people who had probably simply moved on to other towns. But Hayes suspected that the chief's reluctance to investigate stemmed from pressure applied by individuals with enough influence to determine the direction of police priorities. The pattern of disappearances continued throughout 1961 and into 1962, with Dr. Morrison documenting over 40 cases of individuals who had vanished without explanation. Most disturbing was the fact that personal effects belonging to several missing persons had been found in locations that suggested they had been killed rather than simply departing voluntarily. Items of clothing, identification papers, and personal belongings had been discovered in remote areas outside Millbrook, often bearing stains that suggested violence had occurred. But it was the discovery of a photograph in early 1962 that provided the first real evidence linking the disappearances to Millbrook's established community. A hiker exploring the wooded hills east of town had found a damaged camera case containing several rolls of developed film that had been exposed to weather for several months. Most of the photographs were too badly damaged to provide useful information, but one image had survived with enough clarity to shock anyone who examined it carefully. The photograph showed a group of 13 men in formal evening wear standing in what appeared to be an underground chamber lit by torches or candles. The men's faces were partially obscured by shadows, but their expensive clothing and confident postures identified them as members of Millbrook's elite business and professional community. Behind them, barely visible in the dim lighting, were what appeared to be stone altars or tables that bore dark stains and supported objects that the photograph's resolution made impossible to identify clearly. Dr. Morrison, who had discovered the photograph among the personal effects of a missing seasonal worker, recognized several of the figures despite the poor lighting and shadow effects. The tallest man, standing at the center of the group, possessed the distinctive bearing and profile that Morrison associated with Richard Henderson. Other figures bore resemblances to prominent local businessmen, though the photograph's quality made positive identification impossible without additional evidence. The implications of the photograph were staggering and reached far beyond simple criminal activity. If the image accurately depicted what Morrison suspected, then Millbrook's missing persons were not random victims of opportunity, but carefully selected participants in activities that involved some of the town's most respected citizens. The underground setting and formal attire suggested organized, ritualistic activities that required significant planning and coordination among multiple participants. Morrison faced an agonizing decision as he sat in his small office above the town's funeral home. The mysterious photograph spread on his desk like evidence of humanity's capacity for unspeakable evil. He could take his suspicions to Detective Hayes and risk destroying the reputations of men whose families had built Millbrook into a prosperous community. Or he could remain silent and allow whatever was happening to continue, knowing that his inaction might cost additional lives, but would preserve the peace and stability that most residents valued above all else. The decision was made for him. On the morning of October 15, 1962, when contractors working on the Henderson mansion renovation made their horrific discovery. The workers, employees of Patterson Construction Company who had been hired to convert the mansion into luxury apartments, had been attempting to expand the basement storage areas when they encountered the false wall that concealed Richard Henderson's greatest secrets. What they found behind that wall would expose the truth about Millbrook's missing persons and reveal the full extent of the conspiracy that had claimed 39 lives over the course of nearly a decade. The basement chamber contained evidence of systematic murder conducted with the precision and organization of a business operation. The 39 bodies were arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic purposes, with each victim positioned according to specific requirements that reflected careful planning and deliberate symbolism. The state of preservation was unlike anything forensic experts had encountered, with some remains showing minimal decomposition, despite evidence suggesting they had been dead for months or even years. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of detailed records that documented each victim's selection, capture, and death with the methodical precision of scientific research. The files included photographs, personal information, and descriptions of ceremonial procedures that revealed the systematic nature of the murders and the careful thought that had gone into every aspect of the operation. The records implicated not only Richard Henderson, but a network of accomplices that included some of Millbrook's most prominent citizens. The contractors who discovered the false wall behind the Henderson mansion's furnace would never be the same men who had arrived that October morning expecting routine renovation work. Frank Patterson, owner of Patterson Construction and a 30-year veteran of building projects throughout central Pennsylvania, had supervised the demolition of countless structures and encountered his share of surprises hidden within old walls. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what lay concealed beneath the Henderson estate. Patterson's crew had been working methodically through the basement expansion project for 3 weeks, carefully removing sections of the original stone foundation to create additional storage space for the planned apartment conversion. The work required precision and patience, as the mansion's 19th-century construction methods demanded respect for load-bearing elements that modern contractors might overlook. The limestone foundation blocks, each weighing several hundred pounds, had been set with mortar techniques that created structures built to last centuries. It was Tommy Chun, Patterson's youngest crew member and a recent graduate of the Pennsylvania State University engineering program, who first noticed the irregularity in the basement's eastern wall. Chun had been measuring dimensions for the architectural drawings when his calculations revealed a discrepancy between the mansion's exterior measurements and the interior basement space. According to his precise calculations, approximately 12 feet of space was unaccounted for behind what appeared to be a solid limestone wall. The discovery might have been dismissed as a simple error in the original blueprints, except for Chun's meticulous nature and his engineering training that emphasized the importance of accurate measurements. He spent 2 additional days verifying his calculations, using multiple measuring techniques and consulting the original construction documents filed with the county clerk's office in 1881. Every method confirmed that significant space existed beyond the basement's eastern boundary, space that served no apparent purpose according to the official building plans. Patterson initially resisted Chun's recommendation to investigate the hidden area, citing concerns about structural integrity and the project's already tight timeline. The apartment conversion had been commissioned by Richard Henderson's estate executors, who were eager to complete the work and begin generating rental income from the property. Any delays would require additional approvals and potentially expose the construction company to penalty clauses in their contract. But Chun's persistence and his reputation for thorough work eventually convinced Patterson to authorize a careful exploration of the mysterious space. Using pneumatic hammers and specialized demolition equipment, the crew began removing sections of the limestone wall, working slowly to avoid damaging any structural elements that might be supporting the floors above. The mortar between the stones proved unusually resistant to their tools, requiring significantly more effort than normal construction materials from the same period. As the first stones fell away, the crew was met with a blast of air that carried odors unlike anything they had encountered in decades of construction work. The smell was complex and disturbing, combining elements of decay, chemicals, and something metallic that made several workers step back from the opening they had created. The air temperature in the hidden space registered nearly 15 degrees, colder than the surrounding basement, despite the area's complete isolation from outside weather conditions. Patterson ordered his crew to install temporary ventilation equipment before proceeding further, a decision that may have saved their lives given what investigators would later discover about the atmospheric conditions within the hidden chambers. The ventilation fans ran for 6 hours before the air quality improved sufficiently to allow safe entry, and even then, workers were required to wear protective masks and maintain constant communication with supervisors stationed outside the concealed area. The first chamber they entered was approximately 20 feet square, with walls that had been finished with brick and mortar work far superior to the rough limestone construction visible throughout the rest of the basement. The floor was covered with carefully fitted stone tiles that created intricate geometric patterns, while the ceiling featured archways that demonstrated sophisticated engineering techniques rarely seen in residential construction. Electric lighting had been installed using methods and materials that appeared to date from the 1950s, suggesting the space had been actively used in recent years. But it was the discovery of the second chamber that transformed the renovation project into a crime scene that would haunt everyone involved. Beyond the first room, accessible through a heavy wooden door, fitted with multiple locks and reinforcement hardware, lay a larger space that contained evidence of activities that defied rational explanation. The room measured approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, with a vaulted ceiling that rose 15 feet above the floor level. The walls of this second chamber were lined with wooden shelving that contained hundreds of glass containers, each carefully labeled with dates, numbers, and cryptic notations that meant nothing to the construction workers but would later prove significant to forensic investigators. The containers held preserved specimens that ranged from small tissue samples to larger anatomical elements, all maintained in chemical solutions that had kept them in perfect condition for what appeared to be extended periods. Along the chamber's eastern wall stood a series of metal tables that bore the unmistakable stains and scratches associated with medical or surgical procedures. The tables were equipped with drainage systems, restraint hardware, and lighting arrangements that suggested they had been used for activities requiring careful observation and documentation. Nearby cabinets contained surgical instruments, bottles of chemicals, and other equipment that belonged in a hospital operating room rather than a private residence's basement. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a third chamber, accessible through yet another locked door, that contained the 39 bodies that would make the Henderson case one of Pennsylvania's most notorious unsolved mysteries. The victims had been arranged in 3 concentric circles around a central area that contained what could only be described as an altar constructed from human bones. The preservation of the remains was so complete that forensic experts would initially suspect the deaths had occurred recently, until carbon dating and other scientific analysis revealed that some victims had been dead for nearly a decade. The bodies showed evidence of systematic torture and mutilation conducted with surgical precision and apparent medical knowledge. Each victim had been subjected to procedures that suggested their deaths were not the result of random violence, but rather the culmination of carefully planned rituals that required specific techniques and extensive preparation. The arrangement of the remains followed patterns that indicated symbolic or ceremonial significance, with positioning that reflected deliberate thought and organization. Patterson immediately contacted the Millbrook Police Department, though his initial report failed to convey the full scope of what his crew had discovered. Police Chief Crawford arrived at the scene within an hour, accompanied by Detective Hayes and Dr. Morrison, who had been summoned to provide preliminary medical assessment of the remains. The 3 officials spent less than 30 minutes in the underground chambers before ordering the area sealed and declaring the mansion a crime scene. The speed with which authorities moved to limit access to the Henderson basement suggested that someone in positions of authority understood the implications of the discovery and wanted to control the flow of information from the beginning. Within 6 hours of Patterson's initial report, the mansion was surrounded by police barriers, and all construction workers had been sworn to secrecy under threat of prosecution for interfering with a criminal investigation. Federal agents arrived from Philadelphia the following morning, taking control of the case from local authorities with an efficiency that suggested they had been expecting something like this discovery. The agents, who identified themselves as members of a specialized task force dealing with organized criminal activity, immediately expanded the security perimeter around the mansion and began conducting interviews with anyone who had knowledge of the basement chambers. Dr. Morrison, whose coroner duties gave him official standing in the investigation, was among the first to be questioned by the federal agents. Their inquiries focused not on the identity of the victims or the methods used to kill them, but rather on what Morrison might know about other individuals who had been aware of the basement's existence. The agents seemed particularly interested in determining whether Richard Henderson had been acting alone or as part of a larger organization. The questioning revealed that federal authorities possessed information about the Henderson case that extended far beyond what local officials had gathered through their own investigations. The agents referenced files and evidence that suggested they had been monitoring activities in Millbrook for an extended period, possibly predating the discovery of the basement chambers by months or even years. Their knowledge of local personalities and business relationships indicated a level of surveillance that would have required significant resources and long-term planning. Henderson construction workers found themselves subjected to intensive background checks and repeated interviews that explored every detail of their discovery and their previous interactions with Henderson family members. The workers were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements that threatened severe legal consequences for anyone who discussed the case with unauthorized individuals, including family members and friends. The federal takeover of the investigation effectively ended any possibility that local authorities would uncover the full truth about the Henderson basement murders. Detective Hayes, who had spent months trying to investigate the missing persons cases, found himself excluded from briefings and denied access to evidence that his own department had collected. Police Chief Crawford, despite his political connections and administrative authority, was relegated to providing security support for federal agents who clearly considered local law enforcement incompetent or compromised. The mansion itself was subjected to a methodical search that lasted for 3 weeks, during which federal agents removed truckloads of documents, photographs, and physical evidence that provided insight into the scope of Richard Henderson's activities. The agents worked with the efficiency of a military operation, cataloging and removing materials according to procedures that suggested they were following predetermined protocols for handling this type of investigation. But the most significant discovery during the federal search was not found in the basement chambers where the bodies had been discovered. Hidden within Richard Henderson's private study on the mansion's second floor, agents uncovered a collection of documents that revealed the Henderson murders were not the work of a single disturbed individual, but rather the activities of an organized group that included some of central Pennsylvania's most prominent citizens. The documents included membership lists, financial records, and correspondence that implicated judges, politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials in a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly a decade. The evidence suggested that the Henderson basement had served as the ceremonial center for a secret organization that combined elements of organized crime, political corruption, and ritualistic murder in ways that challenged everything investigators thought they knew about criminal behavior. Names appearing in the Henderson documents included federal Judge Martin Walsh, whose court decisions had influenced Pennsylvania law for 2 decades. State Senator David Coleman, whose political career had been built on a reputation for moral leadership and family values. Millbrook Mayor Ernest Thompson, who had overseen the town's transformation into a prosperous industrial community. And most disturbing of all, Police Chief Crawford, whose position had given him the authority to suppress investigations and protect the organization from official scrutiny. The implications of these revelations extended far beyond the Henderson basement murders. If the documents were authentic, they suggested that corruption had penetrated the highest levels of Pennsylvania's political and judicial systems, creating a network of influence that could manipulate legal proceedings, suppress investigations, and eliminate threats to the organization's continued operation. The 39 victims found in the basement represented only a fraction of the human cost associated with maintaining this conspiracy of silence and power. The events that led to the systematic murder of 39 individuals in the Henderson basement began to unfold on a bitter February evening in 1954, when Richard Henderson received an unexpected visitor at his mansion on Elm Hill. The visitor was Vincent Caruso, a man whose reputation preceded him throughout the industrial cities of Pennsylvania and Ohio as someone who could solve problems that conventional business methods could not address. Caruso had arrived in Millbrook driving a black Cadillac sedan that drew attention from neighbors who were unaccustomed to seeing such expensive automobiles in their residential area after dark. The car bore license plates from New York State, and local residents who observed Caruso's arrival noted his expensive overcoat and the deferential manner of the chauffeur who accompanied him. Everything about the visitor suggested connections to organizations that operated outside the boundaries of legitimate business. Margaret Henderson had been attending a charity fundraiser at the Millbrook Country Club that evening, leaving Richard alone in the mansion when Caruso arrived for their private meeting. The timing was deliberate, as the conversation they were about to have required absolute privacy and could not risk being overheard by anyone who might question the nature of their business relationship. Richard had dismissed the household staff early, ensuring that no witnesses would be present to observe or remember details about his mysterious guest. The meeting took place in Richard's private study, a room lined with law books, business documents, and family photographs that projected an image of respectability and conventional success. But the conversation that unfolded there would transform Richard Henderson from a prosperous businessman into the leader of a criminal organization that combined elements of organized crime, political corruption, and ritualistic murder in ways that defied conventional criminal classification. Caruso had come to Millbrook with a proposition that promised to solve Richard's most pressing business problems while opening doors to levels of wealth and influence that he had never imagined possible. The Henderson Steel Works was facing increasing competition from larger manufacturers in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, companies that possessed technological advantages and political connections that threatened to drive smaller operators out of business entirely. Richard needed capital, contracts, and political protection that conventional banking and business relationships could not provide. The solution Caruso offered came with strings attached that would bind Richard to obligations extending far beyond simple business partnerships. The organization Caruso represented possessed the resources and connections necessary to ensure the Henderson Steel Works not only survived, but prospered beyond Richard's most ambitious expectations. Government contracts worth millions of dollars could be arranged through political contacts. Competing businesses could be eliminated through methods that ranged from economic pressure to more direct interventions. Banking relationships could be established that would provide unlimited capital for expansion and modernization. But membership in Caruso's organization required demonstrations of loyalty that went beyond signing contracts or making financial commitments. New members were expected to participate in activities that would forever bind them to the group through shared guilt and mutual dependence. The organization operated on principles that ensured no member could betray the group without destroying himself in the process, creating loyalty through complicity in crimes that would result in life, imprisonment, or death sentences if exposed to law enforcement. Richard Henderson's initiation into this criminal brotherhood began with relatively minor infractions that gradually escalated in severity and moral corruption. Initial assignments involved tax evasion, fraudulent government contract bids, and bribery of local officials, activities that Richard could rationalize as necessary business practices in a competitive economic environment. The profits generated by these illegal activities were substantial and immediate, providing the Henderson Steel Works with advantages that legitimate competitors could not match. But as months passed and Richard became more deeply embedded in the organization's operations, the assignments became increasingly violent and morally reprehensible. Competitors who refused to accept buyout offers suffered industrial accidents that eliminated their ability to continue operations. Union organizers who attempted to negotiate better working conditions for steelworkers disappeared under circumstances that discouraged other labor leaders from making similar efforts. Government inspectors who identified safety violations at Henderson facilities found themselves transferred to distant assignments or forced into early retirement. The transformation of Richard Henderson's basement into a center for ritualistic murder began in the summer of 1954, when Caruso informed him that the organization required a secure location for activities that demanded absolute privacy and sophisticated facilities for disposing of evidence. The limestone chambers beneath the mansion provided ideal conditions for these purposes, offering natural soundproofing, climate control, and accessibility that could be controlled without attracting attention from neighbors or local authorities. Richard initially believed the basement would be used primarily for meetings and document storage, activities that seemed consistent with the organization's legitimate business interests. The extensive renovations required to prepare the space were expensive, but not unusual for a man of Richard's wealth and social position. The installation of soundproofing, specialized lighting, and ventilation equipment could be explained as necessary improvements for wine storage and private business conferences. The first murder conducted in the Henderson basement occurred on Halloween night in 1954, a date that was chosen for its symbolic significance and its practical advantages. For conducting activities that required concealment from the surrounding community. The victim was Samuel Brooks, a freelance journalist from Philadelphia, who had been investigating connections between organized crime and legitimate businesses in central Pennsylvania's industrial cities. Brooks had spent months gathering evidence about corruption in government contracting, labor union manipulation, and the mysterious disappearances of individuals who had opposed certain business interests. His investigation had led him to Millbrook and specifically to the Henderson Steel Works, where he had begun asking questions about the company's rapid expansion and its political connections. Brooks had scheduled interviews with several local officials and was preparing to publish articles that would have exposed the organization's activities to public scrutiny. The journalist's death was orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, involving coordination between multiple organization members and careful attention to details that would ensure the murder could not be traced to its perpetrators. Brooks was lured to a supposed meeting with a confidential source who claimed to possess documents proving corruption in state government. The meeting location was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook, where Brooks was captured and transported to the Henderson basement for what Caruso described as an initiation ceremony that would bind all participants to the organization. Through shared responsibility for murder, Richard Henderson found himself standing in his own basement, surrounded by 12 other men whose faces were partially concealed by ceremonial masks, watching as Vincent Caruso explained the rules that would govern their participation in Samuel Brooks's execution. Each member of the group would be required to participate directly in the killing, ensuring that no one could claim innocence or distance themselves from the crime if investigations occurred. The murder would be conducted according to specific, ritualistic requirements that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The practical aspects of the ritual ensured that evidence was controlled and that each participant's involvement was documented through photographs and other records that could be used to guarantee silence and loyalty. The symbolic elements reinforced the organization's power structure and created psychological bonds that transcended simple criminal association. Members who participated in these ceremonies became bound to each other and to the organization's leadership through experiences that could not be undone or forgotten. Brooks's murder established patterns that would be repeated 38 additional times over the following 8 years, as the organization used the Henderson basement to eliminate threats, punish disloyalty, and initiate new members into their criminal brotherhood. Each victim was selected according to specific criteria that balanced the organization's practical needs with the ritualistic requirements that governed their ceremonial activities. The victims included journalists, law enforcement officers, government officials, and business competitors who posed threats to the organization's operations. But they also included individuals who were chosen purely for their symbolic value or their suitability for specific ceremonial purposes. Young adults with no family connections, transient workers who would not be missed, and individuals whose disappearances could be explained by natural causes or voluntary departure from the community. Dr. James Morrison, who had been recruited into the organization through financial pressures and threats to his medical practice, served as the group's expert on anatomy, physiology, and the technical aspects of preserving evidence for future use. Morrison's medical knowledge was essential for conducting the elaborate torture and dismemberment that characterized many of the basement murders, while his position as county coroner allowed him to control official investigations and ensure that inconvenient questions were never pursued. Judge Martin Walsh provided legal protection for the organization's activities, using his judicial authority to dismiss charges, suppress evidence, and ensure that law enforcement investigations were directed away from organization members. Walsh's court had jurisdiction over criminal cases throughout central Pennsylvania, giving him the power to control prosecutions that might have exposed the conspiracy's existence. Police Chief William Crawford served as the organization's eyes and ears within local law enforcement, providing advance warning of investigations, eliminating inconvenient evidence, and ensuring that police resources were never directed toward activities that might threaten organization security. Crawford's position allowed him to control information flow and manipulate official records in ways that protected the group from detection. The basement ceremonies followed elaborate protocols that combined elements of secret society rituals with practical requirements for controlling evidence and ensuring participant loyalty. New members were required to demonstrate their commitment through increasingly severe acts of violence, while veteran members competed for leadership positions through their willingness to participate in the most extreme and degrading activities. Richard Henderson's role as the organization's ceremonial leader and the provider of their meeting location gave him tremendous influence within the group, but also made him dependent on their protection and support for maintaining his position. In Millbrook society, the wealth and political connections he gained through organization membership came at the cost of his soul and his freedom, binding him to criminal activities that escalated in severity and frequency as the years passed. By 1962, the Henderson basement had become a charnel house containing evidence of systematic murder conducted over nearly a decade. The 39 bodies discovered by Patterson Construction represented only the victims, whose remains had been preserved for ceremonial purposes. Additional victims had been disposed of through methods that left no physical evidence, while others had been killed at different locations to avoid concentrating too much attention on the Henderson mansion. The discovery of the basement chambers would expose not only the murders themselves, but the broader conspiracy that had corrupted Millbrook's political, business, and law enforcement establishments. Federal agents who investigated the case would uncover evidence of crimes that extended far beyond Pennsylvania's borders, implicating organization members in activities that had influenced elections, shaped legislation, and eliminated threats to criminal operations throughout the northeastern United States. The true scope of the Henderson conspiracy began to emerge 6 months after the basement discovery, when federal investigators uncovered a cache of documents hidden within the walls of the Millbrook First National Bank. The discovery came about through the meticulous work of Special Agent Catherine Reynolds, a forensic accountant who had been assigned to trace the financial networks that had funded the organization's activities for nearly a decade. Reynolds possessed a reputation within federal law enforcement circles for her ability to uncover financial crimes that other investigators had missed or dismissed as too complex to pursue. Her background in international banking fraud had prepared her for the intricate web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transactions that characterize sophisticated criminal organizations. But even her extensive experience had not prepared her for the systematic documentation that the Henderson Group had maintained of their criminal activities. The bank documents had been concealed within a specially constructed vault that existed behind the main safety deposit box facility, accessible only through a combination of keys and codes that required coordination between multiple individuals to open. The vault's existence had been known only to bank president Harold Westfield, who had committed suicide 3 days after the federal investigation began, leaving behind a confession that implicated dozens of Millbrook's most prominent citizens in activities ranging from money laundering to murder. Westfield's suicide note, found on his desk at the bank alongside a loaded revolver that he had used to end his life, provided federal investigators with their first comprehensive Overview of the organization structure and the scope of their criminal enterprises. The note, written in Westfield's careful banker's handwriting, read like a confession from a man who had spent years carrying the weight of knowledge that had finally become unbearable. The confession revealed that Westfield had been recruited into the organization through financial pressures and threats to his family's safety, but had gradually become one of its most valuable members through his ability to manage the complex financial transactions that kept the group operational. His bank had served as the primary conduit for laundering money generated through illegal activities, while also providing loans and financial services that gave organization members advantages over legitimate competitors. According to Westfield's account, the organization had generated over $15 million in illegal profits during the 8 years of its operation, money that had been reinvested in legitimate businesses, political campaigns, and additional criminal activities that expanded their influence throughout central Pennsylvania and beyond. The financial records hidden in the bank vault documented every transaction, creating a paper trail that federal investigators could follow to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The documents revealed that the Henderson basement murders had been only one aspect of a much larger criminal enterprise that included drug trafficking, arms smuggling, political corruption, and systematic extortion of businesses and individuals throughout the region. The ritualistic killings had served multiple purposes within the organization's structure, providing both practical solutions to security problems and ceremonial bonding experiences that strengthened loyalty among members. Financial records showed that each basement murder had generated substantial profits for the organization through various means that demonstrated the group's businesslike approach to criminal activity. Victims were carefully selected not only for their symbolic or ceremonial value, but also for their potential contribution to the organization's financial objectives. Life insurance policies had been purchased on many victims months before their deaths, with organization numbers listed as beneficiaries through complex legal arrangements that obscured the true nature of their relationships. Property and business assets belonging to victims had been acquired through fraudulent transactions that transferred ownership to organization members or shell companies that they controlled. Personal possessions of significant value, including jewelry, artwork, and collectibles, had been systematically harvested and sold through networks of dealers who asked no questions about provenance. Even the victims' identities had been commodified, with Social Security numbers and other personal information sold to criminal organizations that specialized in identity theft. The documentation hidden in the bank vault included detailed profiles of each basement victim that read like business prospectuses rather than criminal records. Samuel Brooks, the journalist whose murder had inaugurated the basement ceremonies, had possessed life insurance policies worth over $50,000 and owned property in Philadelphia that was valued at twice that amount. His death had generated nearly $150,000 in profits for the organization, money that had been reinvested in expanding their criminal operations. Martha Gonzalez, a social worker from Harrisburg who had been investigating irregularities in state welfare programs that benefited organization members, had been killed after her investigation began threatening lucrative fraud schemes that generated millions in illegal profits. Her murder had been timed to coincide with her preparation of a report that would have exposed corruption extending to the highest levels of state government. The organization had acquired her research files and used the information to expand their welfare fraud operations while eliminating the threat of exposure. Robert Chen, a young engineer who had discovered structural defects in construction projects funded by organization members, had been murdered to prevent his testimony in lawsuits that could have cost the group tens of millions of dollars in damages and criminal penalties. His death had allowed defective construction to remain hidden, leading to building collapses that killed dozens of innocent people over the following years. The organization had profited both from eliminating Chun's testimony and from insurance Claims related to the building failures his death had prevented from being exposed. The financial records revealed that the organization had systematically targeted individuals whose deaths would generate multiple streams of revenue while serving their operational security needs. Victims were selected through careful analysis of their financial assets, insurance coverage, property holdings, and potential for creating problems that would be expensive to resolve through legal means. The basement murders represented calculated business decisions rather than random acts of violence or ritualistic killing for purely ceremonial purposes. Agent Reynolds discovered that the organization had maintained detailed cost-benefit analyses for each proposed murder, documents that calculated the potential profits against the risks and expenses associated with planning and executing the killings. The basement ceremonies had been designed to minimize costs while maximizing both financial returns and psychological impact on organization members. The ritualistic elements served practical purposes by ensuring participant loyalty through shared guilt while creating memorable experiences that strengthened group cohesion. The documents also revealed the existence of a broader network of similar organizations operating throughout the northeastern United States, all coordinated through a central leadership structure that provided resources, expertise, and protection. For local groups like the Henderson conspiracy, the Millbrook operation had been one of 12 regional cells that reported to a national organization based in New York City, with connections extending to political figures, business leaders, and organized crime families throughout the country. Communication records found in the bank vault showed regular correspondence between Richard Henderson and organization leaders in major cities from Boston to Washington, D.C. The letters discussed coordination of criminal activities, sharing of resources and expertise, and plans for expanding operations into new geographic areas and criminal enterprises. The Henderson Group had served as a testing ground for methods and techniques that were later implemented by other cells throughout the network. Financial transfers documented in the bank records showed that the Millbrook operation had contributed over $3 million to the national organization during its 8 years of operation, while receiving technical support, political protection, and access to markets for their illegal products and services. The basement murders had been conducted according to procedures developed by the national organization and refined through experience gained at multiple locations throughout their network of regional cells. The discovery of photographic evidence hidden within the bank vault provided federal investigators with visual documentation of the basement ceremonies that corroborated the financial records and witness testimonies they had gathered. The photographs, stored in fireproof containers that had preserved them in perfect condition, showed not only the murders themselves, but also the preparation rituals, cleanup procedures, and disposal methods that had been used to eliminate evidence. The images revealed the systematic nature of the basement operations and the careful attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of the murders. Victims had been prepared according to specific protocols that maximized both their ceremonial impact and their practical value as sources of biological materials that the organization sold to research institutions and medical facilities. The basement had operated as both a killing ground and a processing facility that generated profits from every aspect of the victims' deaths. Most disturbing of all were photographs that documented the participation of Millbrook community leaders in the basement ceremonies. Images that showed respected citizens engaging in acts of torture, mutilation, and cannibalism that revealed the depths of moral corruption that the organization had achieved. The photographs included not only the murders themselves, but also social gatherings where organization members celebrated their crimes and planned future operations. Federal investigators identified over 30 individuals in the photographs, including elected officials, business leaders, law enforcement officers, and religious figures whose public reputation stood in stark contrast to their documented participation in ritualistic murder. The images provided irrefutable evidence that the Henderson conspiracy had penetrated every aspect of Millbrook society and had corrupted individuals who held positions of public trust and moral authority. The photographic evidence also revealed the international scope of the organization's operations, with images showing visitors from other countries participating in the basement ceremonies and receiving training in techniques that they would presumably implement in their home nations. The Henderson basement had served as both a local killing ground and an international training facility where representatives from criminal organizations throughout the world learned methods for combining ritualistic murder with profitable criminal enterprises. Agent Reynolds' analysis of the financial and photographic evidence revealed that the Henderson organization had been planning a significant expansion of their operations at the time their basement was discovered. Documents found in the bank vault showed that they had been negotiating with criminal organizations in Canada and Mexico to establish similar operations throughout North America, with plans for eventually expanding into Europe and Asia through partnerships with existing criminal networks. The expansion plans included detailed budgets for establishing basement facilities in other cities, training programs for new organization members, and marketing strategies for selling their services to political figures and business leaders who required solutions to problems that conventional methods could not address. The Henderson Group had been developing a franchise model that would allow them to export their methods and techniques to criminal organizations throughout the world. Financial projections found among the documents suggested that the organization had expected to generate over $100 million in annual profits within 5 years through the expansion of their operations. The basement murders had been intended as proof of concept, demonstrations that would convince other criminal groups to adopt their methods and pay licensing fees for access to their techniques and expertise. The discovery of the bank documents also revealed the extent to which the organization had infiltrated legitimate institutions throughout central Pennsylvania and beyond. Membership lists found in the vault showed that the group had recruited individuals from federal law enforcement agencies, state government offices, major corporations, and academic institutions who provided intelligence, protection, and legitimacy for their criminal activities. The infiltration had been systematic and strategic, with organization members seeking positions that would give them access to information, influence over investigations, and ability to manipulate legal proceedings that might threaten their operations. Federal agencies investigating the Henderson case discovered that some of their own agents had been providing information to organization members, compromising investigations and allowing criminals to escape prosecution. The revelations contained in the bank documents would ultimately lead to the largest organized crime investigation in Pennsylvania history, with federal agents working for over 3 years to trace all the connections and prosecute all the individuals implicated in the conspiracy. But the investigation would also reveal the limitations of law enforcement when confronting criminal organizations that had achieved such deep penetration into legitimate institutions and commanded such extensive resources for protecting their members from prosecution. The prosecution of the Henderson conspiracy members would prove to be one of the most challenging legal battles in Pennsylvania history, with federal attorneys facing defendants who possessed unlimited financial resources and political connections that extended to the highest levels of government. The trials, which began in 1964 and continued for nearly 4 years, exposed the limitations of the American justice system when confronting organized criminal networks that had achieved such deep penetration into legitimate institutions. Of the 43 individuals originally indicted in connection with the Henderson basement murders, only 12 would ultimately be convicted and sentenced to prison terms. The others escaped prosecution through various means that demonstrated the organization's continued ability to manipulate legal proceedings even after their criminal activities had been exposed to public scrutiny. Some defendants fled the country and established new identities in nations that refused extradition requests. Others died under suspicious circumstances that prevented them from testifying against their former associates. The most prominent defendant, former federal judge Martin Walsh, suffered a massive heart attack in his courthouse chambers just days before his scheduled testimony was to begin. Medical examiners attributed his death to natural causes, but investigators noted that Walsh had been in excellent health and had shown no previous signs of cardiovascular problems. His death eliminated the prosecution's most valuable witness and removed the individual who possessed the most detailed knowledge of the organization's political connections. Police Chief William Crawford disappeared entirely during the pretrial proceedings, leaving behind only a brief note claiming that he was entering witness protection due to threats against his family. Federal marshals were never able to locate Crawford or confirm that he had actually been enrolled in any official protection program. His disappearance effectively ended the prosecution's ability to trace the organization's infiltration of local law enforcement and limited their understanding of how the conspiracy had operated with such impunity for so many years. The defendants who were convicted received sentences that many observers considered inadequate given the scope and brutality of their crimes. Dr. James Morrison, who had participated directly in the torture and murder of multiple victims, received a 20-year sentence but was released after serving only 8 years due to poor health and exemplary behavior during his incarceration. Mayor Ernest Thompson was sentenced to 15 years, but had his conviction overturned on appeal due to what appellate courts determined were procedural errors during his original trial. The families of the Henderson conspiracy members faced social ostracism and financial ruin as the details of their relatives' crimes became public knowledge. Many changed their names and relocated to distant states in attempts to escape the stigma associated with their family connections to the basement murders. But the psychological trauma of learning the truth about their loved ones would haunt these innocent relatives for generations. Margaret Henderson, who had remained ignorant of her husband's criminal activities until the basement discovery, suffered a complete mental breakdown when confronted with evidence of his participation in ritualistic murder. She spent the remainder of her life in a private psychiatric facility, never recovering from the shock of learning that the man she had married was responsible for the deaths of 39 innocent people. Her children, Thomas IV and Elizabeth, were forced to change their identities and start new lives under assumed names to escape the notoriety associated with their family name. The Henderson mansion on Elm Hill was demolished in 1966 after standing empty for 4 years following the discovery of the basement chambers. Local authorities had attempted to convert the property for public use, but workers refused to enter the building due to reports of unexplained phenomena that made renovation work impossible. Construction crews reported tools that moved on their own, temperature fluctuations that froze workers even during summer heat, and sounds of screaming that seemed to emanate from the sealed basement areas. The land where the mansion once stood remained vacant for decades as prospective buyers were deterred by both the property's notorious history and the strange occurrences that continued to plague the site. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the basement windows of the demolished building, hearing sounds of construction equipment operating during nighttime hours, and witnessing figures moving through the ruins even though the property was secured and monitored by security services. In 1985, the city of Millbrook finally succeeded in redeveloping the Elm Hill property by constructing a public park that covered the entire area where the Henderson mansion had stood. The park was designed to provide community recreation facilities while ensuring that the basement chambers would remain permanently sealed beneath tons of concrete and landscaping. But the park's construction was plagued by accidents and delays that suggested the site's dark history continued to exert influence over anyone who attempted to disturb its secrets. Workers building the park reported equipment failures that occurred with suspicious frequency, particularly when excavation work came near the areas where the basement chambers had been located. Several construction workers quit their jobs after experiencing what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread and despair when working in certain areas of the park. The project's completion required nearly 3 years instead of the 6 months originally projected, with costs that exceeded the initial budget by over 400%. The park officially opened to the public in 1988, but it never achieved the community acceptance that city planners had hoped would finally put the Henderson legacy to rest. Children playing in the park complained of feeling watched by unseen observers, while adults reported an oppressive atmosphere that made recreational activities unenjoyable. The park's playground equipment frequently malfunctioned in ways that endangered children, leading to numerous injuries and eventual removal of most recreational facilities. Modern investigations into the Henderson case have revealed that the organization's influence extended far beyond what federal prosecutors were able to prove during the 1960s trials. Declassified documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests show that the conspiracy had connections to intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and multinational corporations that used the organization's services for eliminating inconvenient witnesses and competitors. The basement murders represented only a small fraction of the deaths that can be attributed to the organization's activities throughout the northeastern United States. Recent analysis of missing persons reports from the 1950s and 1960s has identified over 200 individuals whose disappearances show patterns consistent with the organization's selection criteria and operational methods. These victims were never found, and their cases were never solved. But modern investigators believe they were murdered at facilities similar to the Henderson basement in other cities throughout the organization's network. The true scope of the conspiracy may never be fully understood, as most of the evidence was destroyed and most of the participants are now dead. The Henderson basement discovery remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. While federal investigators succeeded in exposing some aspects of the organization's activities, the full truth about their operations, their membership, and their ultimate objectives died with the individuals who carried those secrets to their graves. The 39 bodies found in that limestone chamber represent not just individual tragedies, but symbols of a systematic evil that achieved levels of influence and sophistication that challenge our understanding of how criminal organizations can operate within democratic societies. The legacy of the Henderson conspiracy serves as a reminder that the pursuit of power and wealth can corrupt individuals and institutions in ways that create lasting damage to entire communities. The innocent families who inherited the shame of their relatives' crimes, the survivors who lost loved ones to the organization's violence, and the citizens of Millbrook who discovered that their community's prosperity had been built on systematic murder all bear witness to the human cost of allowing evil to flourish unchecked. Today, the park that covers the Henderson Mansion site stands as an inadvertent monument to the victims, whose remains still lie beneath its carefully manicured lawns and walking paths. The basement chambers that once echoed with screams and ritual chanting now rest in perpetual silence, sealed beneath concrete and earth, but never forgotten by those who understand the true history of Millbrook's darkest secrets. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.